Hi, this is Horace and you're watching Rock in a Hard Place. And tonight's episode is one of our beginner's guide segments. And this is a section where we get into the catalog of a band and introduce people to it. So I'm here with John again, and we're going to do this segment pretty regularly. So tonight's band is Foreigner. And what I have here is the box set. So we're going to be dealing with the Lou Gramm catalog, and I'll be touching very briefly on Unusual Heat. But essentially, this will be discussing the most important part of the band's catalog, and also be like a great way for someone that isn't familiar with a band to kind of dip their toes in the water and understand what that band is all about. So let's get started. I'm here with John again tonight, and John, unlike me, is not that familiar with Foreigner, and he spent the last couple of weeks enjoying the Foreigner catalog, and he's going to tell you now about his interesting relationship to the genre that Foreigner are the masters of, which is AOR. So, John, can you tell us about your experience as a guy just getting into rock and the stuff that you listen to with AOR?
Yeah, AOR is one of those things that I never really had a lot of experience with because growing up, the two genres of music that I was first attracted to were hard rock and heavy metal and progressive rock. And AOR for me kind of fell into that middle zone where it wasn't heavy enough for the sort of the metal side of me, and it wasn't like arty enough for the when I was in the mood for something more progressive. So I have sort of passing familiarity with a number of AOR bands like Boston, for instance. But Foreigner is one of those bands where aside from the radio songs, I've never actually listened to an album until you encouraged me. It's a great idea for sort of like a segment to sort of like you as the expert and me coming to this catalog for the first time, and me only having only having lived with these albums for like 2 weeks. So I'm really excited to sort of talk about them in this way. So it's been
Right.
very interesting to go through these first couple albums.
Yeah, and Foreigner is a really interesting band to delve into this with somebody, especially with your background, because one of the most interesting things about Foreigner is that they had some very fascinating intersections with the progressive rock world. And Foreigner started as a band. We'll first just quickly discuss the debut. So what's interesting about the debut is Foreigner were a six-man lineup, which is pretty much the largest lineup that you're ever going to deal with in most bands. And that means that you've got two guitarists, a keyboardist, a bass player, a vocalist, and a bassist. And most of us are usually used to four-member bands, or maybe they have a keyboardist or whatever. And you've got this fascinating mix of Mick Jones, the guitarist, who is essentially a guy with an impeccable studio session and English rock cred. And he had played with a band called Spooky Tooth for a while. They're one of the great, we'll probably deal with them at another point, but they're one of the great sort of unsung, unfairly forgotten, like classic rock bands from the 60s, early 70s, who, for trivia junkies, they wrote a song called Better by You, Better Than Me, which was covered infamously by Judas Priest. That's a whole nother story. But there are also a member of King Crimson, and John is a massive King Crimson fan. There's a member of King Crimson on this album, and that's Ian McDonald. So all the stuff about corporate rock, and I don't know, there's some really interesting dudes playing on this record.
Well, I was going to say,
I'm going to hand it to John in a minute, but this, which is the debut and is considered by most to be probably, one of their greatest albums. It's a lot of people's favorite album. It's a really fascinating mix of AOR hits. We all know Long, Long Way from Home. We all know, the hits on this album, but it's also got really fascinating stuff on it, like Star Rider, I Need You, where you hear like these weird, like parking, like space age keyboards. And I have a feeling a lot of that is Ian McDonald. So there's just a sort of fascinating mix of like AOR hard rock and weird progressive rock, like inching in. So I think, John, you were telling me a while before, like this is almost Asia, the prelude.
yeah, well, uh, I really enjoyed this album, and you mentioned Star Rider. I mean, that's the song that really sort of took me by surprise because, like, the first two songs are the hits, two hits, right?
Right.
It was like the first time and Cold as Ice. Those things
Yep.
I was
And
familiar
they're
with.
like they're hard rockers. Boom.
Yeah, and then Star Rider comes, and all of a sudden it's more into the sort of the prog territory, very airy, kind of atmospheric number. I really, really enjoyed it. And I was going to say, like, Ian McDonald is on my two favorite, he's on my two favorite King Crimson albums. He's all over their debut.
Right.
And he also is a guest saxophonist on my favorite album of all time, which is King Crimson's Red. He plays on Starless, and one more Red Nightmare, I think. Um, and just so yeah, I mean, it's sort of that interplay between the more sort of like kind of hard rock and the more sort of progressive sort of sound really took me by surprise, because that proggier side of Foreigner, at least in this early stage of their career, on this debut, is not really represented on what you hear on the radio. So I was really pleased with this first album. I think it was just really great. I was really impressed with it.
Yeah, and it's depending on the day of the week, it's probably song for song, it's probably my favorite Foreigner album, though I'm very fond of the whole Lou Gramm catalog. And by the way, this is probably as good a time as any to talk about Lou. Lou Gramm was the original vocalist for Foreigner. He left in 1990, but he essentially sings on the entire classic catalog. And he's one of the great rock singers. And he's an interesting guy because he not only has a naturally powerful voice, he has a very almost gritty at times sort of blues rock voice, but he's got amazing range and power. And he reminds me a lot of Paul Rodgers from Bad Company. It's just that this guy wound up in an AOR band, whereas Paul Rodgers kind of wound up in more of a traditional blues rock band. But that sells Lou Gramm a little short because there's a lot of strange stuff on these albums, like Star Rider, which has more progressive, and he can do that. He can do the love ballads, which became more prominent in the sound later. But he's able to deliver, and to me, he's sort of in the same category as perhaps a guy like Joe Lynn Turner, who just has that smooth, powerful, but can occasionally be gritty voice, and he's just a phenomenal singer. And what's interesting about him is he made his career in Foreigner, and I think then he went solo and did a couple of more gospel themed albums. But this is a guy with the kind of voice that he could have sung in a heavy metal band, he could have sung in a prog rock band, he could have sung in. He's got one of those voices where he's pretty versatile. He could do almost anything. So now let's get into the second album, which is Double Vision, which also has the 6-band lineup. That's going to start to change as the discography moves. This is very much in line with the first album. It's a mix of really in-your-face rockers, but it has some fascinating stuff. Like there's a really bizarre instrumental on it called Tramatine, which could have been on a King Crimson album. Did you notice there's like this sort of weird instrumental bits on this album?
I love that song, Tramontaine. It's got these real cool, moody kind of like synths,
yes,
guitar lines. It's really great. And then right after that, there's a song called "I've Waited So Long."
Mm-hmm.
I think Jones sings that one, and it almost has like a Beatles-esque sort of like almost like a song John Lennon would write, with those kind of vocal harmonies, and the saxophone solo by Ian McDonald is really cool in that song. Spellbinder, fantastic outro, very atmospheric. I mean, that's really my takeaway from these early albums from the Foreigner catalog, is that they're hard rock, they're AOR, but they have enough quirks in them to make them interesting for somebody like me, who sort of wasn't expecting that. And also Blue Morning, Blue Day, really catchy. I mean, just really.
That's a great example of the pop songwriting, which is Mick Jones, the guitarist, who's really the writing mastermind of Foreigner. He was a genius for hooks, and that's why I always felt we got a bum rap on corporate rock. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on. Now, I completely agree. There are also some just straight ahead. They're pop rockers on this album. So you have this sort of weird mix of this fascinating stuff that you just discussed. And then you have a song like Love is Taking Its Toll, which actually has like sort of a bluesy middle section, but has like lyrics that are so beyond ridiculous, I can't even get into them. It's just like the most sexist thing ever. It's almost hilarious. It's almost like parody. But that's another issue, which is like every song is about, I don't know what was going on with Lou Gramm's love life, but it was a disaster area. But made for some great music though, because the songs are great. But there's some fascinating stuff. And this is actually important to note that this is the album that is the end of the line for the 6-man version of Foreigner. Because after this, we move into Head Games. And at that point, they had cut down to a couple of members got changed. Ian McDonald is out. Or maybe Ian McDonald might still be on, I'm not sure. I'd have to check. But it's definitely a change in sound. And I think you were talking about this. I know Ed Gagliardi, the original bassist, left the band because he had some conflicts with Mick Jones. And I think what happened was they wanted a more straightforward hard rock sound. But what's interesting is when you were talking about this album, John, you said you detected a kind of new wave, like a hard rock and new wave angle on this one.
Well, yeah, I mean,
We're talking about head games.
new wave is sort of like this kind of this catch-all term. I mean, you
Yes.
have bands as different as Talking Heads and Cars, and Blondie being sort of like lumped in with that. When I said new wave, I mean it has sort of like a kind of like a more straightforward sort of sound to it. It's much more hard hitting, streamlined. There's less of those arty sort of tendencies, except for actually there's a song on it called "Blinded by Science," kind of like a cool kind of ballady kind of
Might be
number.
the best song in the album.
Yeah, I love that song. But for the most part, I mean, the songs are much more direct. They're much more hard hitting, right? Love on the Telephone, Women, 17, right? I mean, it's one of those albums where you listen to it and it's just like, and the title track, which was a single, but the title track is one of those great sort of brooding numbers, really hard hitting, almost like a UFO's kind of sound to it. I get kind of a UFO vibe from this album as well.
Yeah, and an interesting part of the UFO vibe is that it's like a UFO Paul Chapman vibe. It's from that really fascinating period, which is sorely underrated and desperately needed its own show, by the way. When you're talking about like the Wild, the Willing, and the Innocent, and like that, like what I call like testosterone fueled hard rock Bruce Springsteen era. There's just this really fascinating sort of mix of like hard rock and other stuff. So yeah, and this is a great album. This actually has my favorite Foreigner song, which is the very twangy. It's almost like some rockabilly from hell number, which is Women, which is just incredibly catchy. And it's really just, it shows the genius of Mick Jones. And you could just get these hooks that are in your head and they don't go away. Great opening track. Blinded by Science is fantastic. Once again, Lou Gramm's Love Life has not improved. Love on the Telephone, I'll Get Even With You. I don't know what was going on, but there's some great stuff on this album. But it is definitely a change in sound. You can definitely sense that. And that leads into their Monster AOR album, which is honestly what I consider to be the peak of their pure AOR period, which is 4. And one of the funny things about 4 is it's got a double meaning. It's not just their 4th album, it's the album where they pared the lineup down to 4 guys. So the 6-man days of Tramatine and all that weird Ian McDonald saxophone. Well, actually, that's funny. There's a major saxophone solo on this album. But for the most part, the weird stuff is gone. But it's still a phenomenal record because this is where they just strip it down to pure AOR power. And there's some really phenomenal stuff on this album for that sound. And of course, that would be Urgent, which has a raging sax solo in it. And there's just a lot of great stuff on the record. But I'm actually a big fan of Nightlife, which is one of their big, like, just in your face kind of rock and roll numbers. So what's your take on this one, John? Because now that it's moved quite a bit away from the more proggy type of elements.
Yeah, so I mean, since I'm new to the band, this is as far as I went.
Right.
For me, I mean, I pretty much like the albums in the order that they were released, in the sense that Debute's my favorite. I really love Double Vision. Head Games, really, exciting, kind of scratches that hard rock itch. I like this album. I think this is a really good album. Although for me, the takeaway for me for this album is that I actually think the hits are the best. My favorite tracks on the album, like so Urgent, Jukebox Hero, right? So the ones that are the most famous are for me the best, and that for me is sort of tells me that that right, it's the kind of album where my relationship to it is sort of like it can only go so far, because for me the other songs are good but not as memorable, and therefore not as successful. So it's a good album. I really enjoy it. Really solid hard rock AOR, whatever you want to call it. But I just, for me, listening to it a couple times, it is, those hits just sort of tower above everything else. So it's my least favorite of the first 4, but I still really, really like it. So
yeah, and I would say this is the one that pushes you the furthest out of your comfort zone, and that this is what I consider to be like textbook heavy AOR, which to me is a very distinctly different genre from there used to be in Kerrang magazine a very funny term that they used called WIMPHEM. They used to invent their own words, and that would be WIMPHEM, and essentially describe the lighter, and they meant it with affection, but it was to describe the lightest end of AOR, which is the very, a much more commercial, lighter, poppier, sort of like a good analogy would be the difference between hair metal and glam as opposed to, or heavy metal and hard rock. But this is what I call heavy AOR. So it's got hits, but it's aggressive, but it's the musical structure is fairly tight. So you're not going to have the kind of the stuff that appeals to people like John and people that are more into the progressive rock. That's pretty much gone at this point. And then from there, John didn't get into it, but we'll just quickly wrap up. I'm working, by the way, from the complete albums box set, which if anybody wants, you can pick this up on Amazon for $30, and it's every major Foreigner album in one neat little clamshell box, which is read at the very end of the episode. But then from there we go on to Agent Provocateur, Inside Information, and Unusual Heat. And Unusual Heat I won't even really get into because that is the first album without Lou Gramm. That's a whole nother story for another time. But these other two albums, though one of them contains what is actually their largest hit, which is I Want to Know What Love Is, which I don't really want to hear again if we're being honest. These albums, it's the end of the line. The lightness started to really take over the sound. There's some good stuff on both records. I wouldn't say they're not worth checking out, but for someone just getting into this band, depending on your tolerance for much lighter AOR, I would definitely stick to the first 4 albums. And then if that's something that you like, by all means, check these out. And then past that, they reformed with Lou Gramm for a few concerts. There's a whole later discography that's a long, very complicated story. But you know, if somebody was going to check that out, I would perhaps check out the Kelly Hansen album, which is called Can't Slow Down, who's the guy who replaced Lou Gramm ultimately in the late 90s, 2000s, I'm sorry. So that's pretty much the Foreigner story. And I would say this is a great band for people that think, oh, you know, AOR is not necessarily my thing. It's a little too commercial. I'm more of like a harder rocking guy. But I would definitely say check out Foreigner because they're not quite as unimaginative as you would think. And I'm working from this. This is the complete albums box set. You can get this on Amazon. So, and this has been an episode of Rock and a Hard Place. And once again, I'm happy to be here with John. And we'll be back to see you again soon.